A lot has happened during the past year and a half at WNL, in the nation, and of course across the globe. During times of upheaval and stress, the values that feel most important to us can become clearer, or they can change. The Mudd Center's program this year will focus our attention on daily ethics. That's how, or if, our personal values are actually manifested in the actions and decisions of our daily lives. Since our habits cumulatively shape our lives and the world around us, we'll think together about the impact of our daily ethics as well. The Daily Ethics Lecture Series will include 10 distinguished speakers from different disciplinary and professional backgrounds. They'll address big questions like defining a meaningful life and making a difference, using information and constructing knowledge in our lives, navigating the responsibilities of being a citizen in our communities, of a nation, the world, and the earth. I think the WNL community will be inspired by how our speakers' personal values have been manifested in their professional choices and activities as well. The Daily Ethics Mosaic project is an especially exciting part of our program this year. The Mudd Center is partnering with the Stanier Gallery and with the artist Jonathan Lee to offer a series of workshops this fall that will culminate in the production of a large-scale community artwork. After so much isolation, the prospect of working on a community project together feels great. The Mosaic workshops will involve individual art making as well as collaborative art making. So students, staff, and faculty will have a chance to think deeply about their own values and choices, and also discuss and create a collective product. I can't wait. right, welcome everybody. I'm Carla Murdoch, Director of the Mudd Center for Ethics, and I'm delighted to launch the winter chapter of our Daily Ethics series with today's lecture by Jay Whitaker. The Daily Ethics series gives us a chance to think and talk about the values that are most important to us and how they're manifested, or how they ought to be manifested, in our lives each day. During the fall term, we had 4 distinguished speakers who brought their perspectives to our year-long discussion. So first, Cheshire Calhoun, the philosopher, discussed the responsibilities and the tensions of deciding in our own minds how things ought to be, as well as practicing morality with other people. Jelani Cobb then contextualized the brief history of our democracy and alerted us to the need for collective and intentional action in order to preserve its ideals. The philosopher Andrew Shignell then came along and described the role of hopeful pessimism in taking steps to actualize our values within the complex realities of the current era. Finally, the playwright Chantal Bilodeau described her work and her vision for art and science to synergistically address a critical moral issue of our time, climate change. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Jay Whitaker. He's the director of the Wilton E. Scott Institute for Energy Innovation and trustee professor in energy engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Professor Whitaker's research focuses on developing and analyzing new materials and systems for electrochemical energy storage and conversion. He also studies the policy aspects of materials and technologies for the energy sector, such as analyzing the economics of scaled production and the energy footprint of manufacturing energy-related products. In 2008, he founded Aqueon Energy, which brought to market sodium-ion batteries, or saltwater batteries, as a non-toxic and low-cost energy storage product. Professor Whitaker has been listed as one of the top 25 eco-innovators in the world by Fortune magazine, and he's won the Lemelson MIT Prize for Innovation. Dr. Whitaker will bring 2 unique perspectives to our consideration of daily ethics. First, as a materials scientist, he has crafted his professional life to address one of the most complex ethical issues that we face: the need for environmentally sustainable energy sources. Thus, he can speak to the choices that have informed and enabled this professional path. Also, as an entrepreneur, he's navigated the ethical challenges of developing innovative products for energy storage and the systems that support them. His talk will help us to consider the process of bringing these new technologies into our lives. So please join me in welcoming Professor Whitaker to discuss the criticality of technical honesty in growing energy technology companies, how even the best intentions can lead to ruin. Thank you.
Great. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I have not been to Lexington before, so it's a real pleasure. And I feel like I'm coming back a little bit to my heritage. My undergraduate degree was at Oberlin College. And this feels, it's a very similar vibe. So it's lovely to be back amongst people who are engaging in the liberal arts education process. And those of you who are wondering, what will I do as I get my degree and move on? You could do anything. My path was unusual, but I became an engineer and then ended up doing all sorts of other things. And some of that I'm going to talk about today. And thank you also to the Mudd Center. It's great to have this invitation. I'm still not sure how you got my name or how this came to pass, but it's a real honor. I really appreciate it. So just real quickly, you already, in my introduction, went through where I come from. A key thing that's interesting about CMU is the Department of Engineering and Public Policy that I do want to talk just 1 second about. We are encouraged to engage in research that is at the intersection of science and technology in policy, and in general humanities. And part of what I'm talking about today is going to focus on the effect of confirmation bias on entrepreneurship, and is something I actually do work on and teach in classes in this department. So it's more than just a side hobby in some ways. Sometimes I wonder how to justify the things that I'm interested in, but because I have this very unusual set of appointments at CMU, I get to do some really fun things. And I've also had the distinct pleasure of working with many companies. These are the 4 companies that I work with right now most deeply. And a lot of what I know and see and have learned historically, I'm working now with these companies to do. And I'm not going to get into the details. It would take too long. But I'm engaged academically and entrepreneurially with a range of places right now. It's been a fun couple of years. So part of what I want to talk about is how innovation and entrepreneurship is affected by the way that we think and process things as a human. And when we think of innovation and entrepreneurship, or what I do anyway, there's these 2 axes I think that really matter. One, for any given concept or invention or venture, one axis is the impact. If I'm successful, how much impact will I have, or will the idea have? And the other axis is the degree of technical uncertainty that I will, take on if I try to do it. And there's kind of 4 quadrants you can imagine here. Things that are low degree of technical uncertainty and a low degree of potential impact. Probably not that new, probably not that interesting, not usually sought after to engage in by entrepreneurs. Things that are highly technical uncertain, but probably will have a low impact, typically not worth pursuing. Sometimes things have a perceived high degree of impact, and they have actually not a real impact. There's many cases of people evolving ideas that they think have high impact. The reality is that they don't, and they probably shouldn't be pursuing it. That lack of perception is not really on the table today, but I think it's something to keep in mind. There's the real impact that you could have, and there's the perceived impact. There are things that have low degree of technical uncertainty, high impact. So these have high value. They're often things that are ready to be scaled, or they're already at scale. It's been done before. And then there's this quadrant, and this is really where the action is in terms of growing new things. I work in the climate tech space in general. I'm very interested, as my introduction said, in energy storage, integration with renewables, and reducing the carbon footprint of energy technologies in general. And there are many things that have a high degree of technical uncertainty, but a very high degree of impact if they work. In fact, many of the funders and researchers I work with will say, I only want to do things that have a gigaton impact. And what they mean is, if this works, it will help reduce the global carbon impact by a gigaton or more. So that's the sort of scale of things that me and my colleagues think in. So high impact, but oftentimes a lot of uncertainty. So with the uncertainty comes these things. More expense. Like technical uncertainty, it costs money to reduce the uncertainty. So more expense, more time, there's higher risk. And when I say risk, I'm going to think about risk in terms of what the academic definition of risk is. It's the chance of failure multiplied by the severity of the consequence of that failure. So it's not, when you think of risk, I have a very a good sense, I think of, what's the risk of this? Well, if it fails, how frequently will it fail? And then what happens if it does? And the much higher risk when you're up in this upper right quadrant. But on the other hand, much higher rewards, right? You can change the world. You can make a lot of money. You can have a lot of impact in general. And this brings stress, personal human stress to your mind. Impact comes at the same time, and you see why these things come together. People are willing to fund more aggressively things that will have higher impact. With that funding comes more pressure, less time, more stress. So more uncertainty, technical uncertainty means you need more time, and higher potential impact means you have less time to do it. So there's this inherent stress between what the y-axis wants and what the x-axis dictates. And of course, this leads to, again, more stress if you were trying to do this as a human. So we've all heard different takes on this entrepreneurial process. Among the many folks, and there's many people who can look up, countless Elon Musk quotes or Thomas Edison quotes. I have a couple of those later in the talk. fake it till you make it, right? I'm going to keep blustering through this until somehow it works. But I'm cognizant that what I'm doing right now is not actually functioning, but I'm going to keep representing it, and it's eventually going to work. But there's other things. You could believe in your idea until it works, but you never fake it. You tell the world and your funders and whoever you're working with, this is not working yet. I'm going to continue to make it better, but I'm challenged, and it will evolve. That may or may not work for you. You may or may not raise another round of funding. You may or may not keep yourself relevant. Faking it allows you to keep relevant, but you may also have some real issues down the road. Or you can keep pivoting the approach. As opposed to trying to do the exact same thing you're doing, maybe you're outcome-oriented. And when you're outcome-oriented, you say, well, there's 4 different ways I could get there. I could try this approach, or this approach, or that approach. And that pivoting that you're doing also gets you to where you want to go, but it also takes more time, and it takes more patience. And sometimes people who fund you won't tolerate that either. On the other hand, I work with some investors. There's a particular firm called Breakthrough Energy Ventures. It's one of Bill Gates's firms. And their specific thing is we find a problem and we find a team, we put them together, and we will support them as they keep pivoting until it works, right? So there's different ways to think about how you would go after it. Or you can lie until you get caught and go to jail. So it's unclear to me what this person was thinking during the time, and it's a fascinating story. If you haven't read Bad Blood, it's a great book. And I marvel at, what could they have been thinking? Because they had no evidence that what they were trying to do was actually going to work, and yet they kept going. And that is a very strange, the dissonance there is complex to me. And that doesn't seem to be a very good pathway. So, and the other thing that I'll say amongst all of these different approaches is that within the energy and climate tech space, there's a very, very high percentage of startup failures. Aqueon Energy, which was mentioned, was founded and funded in 2008 initially, and we were amongst a class of probably 100 to 200 startups within plus or minus a year that were energy or climate tech related. Almost none of them made it. Very few. Single digits, maybe 10 are still really relevant from that time frame, and fewer of them than that are actually profitable. So the amount of money, the billions that were poured in, and the outcome, which is almost no success, is kind of interesting. What fuels this and why? And so I've thought a lot about that and about the process and about decisions that led to that much failure. You would expect, everyone expects in the venture community some degree of failure, but it's definitely higher in this space than was anticipated. So when these firms go to innovate, what fuels them? Is it Red Bull? Maybe. Or actually, I propose to you it's confirmation bias. And a lot of the next handful of slides is about confirmation bias, and then we're going to do some case studies that sort of allow us to view a couple different tech firms' approaches in the context of the confirmation bias that the entrepreneurs and inventors were experiencing as they were doing it. So and I propose to you that even though it looks and it often is thought of and portrayed as something that's bad and not to be embraced, it actually is an asset as well. And so understanding both sides of it and how to use it and recognize it is sort of what I think is really important. So this is not a new concept, and we're at a liberal arts college, and a Francis Bacon quote I think is highly relevant. I'm not going to read the entire thing because it's kind of long, but I will say that if I look at the last sentence, he talks about, actually, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you can see, if you read this yourself, if you take 2 minutes to read this or 1 minute to read it, it basically talks about how we take in ideas and then it locks in. And then the rest of the time, after we take in more ideas, we will continue to try to tuck in those ideas into the foundation that we've already created. This limits our ability to see what might be actually true. Instead, we try to take things from outside and force it into the structure that we've already generated in our mind in terms of a concept or a pathway or an idea. And this involves a great and pernicious prejudgment through which the intellect's former conclusions remain inviolate. So in other words, we cannot figure out what really should happen. We only can figure out what we think is happening based on our previous preconceived notions. And many folks prior to this, a handful of Greek philosophers, for example, also called this out. But this is a human feature that we all deal with on a daily basis. So where does it come from? We all have the desire to believe in something consistent and with ourselves, with our own set of beliefs, our own set of information that we've collected throughout our lives. And we want it to be consistent, right? And this then consistent with what? Consistent with what information we've already presumed or consumed. So information primacy really matters. When you take in whenever you learn something, as you are in a classroom or out in the real world, or you're engaging with your peers, you are constantly trying to integrate what's coming with what you've already gotten inside of your head. And the information primacy that exists within your mind is unavoidable and always creates a prism through which you see everything new. And the last thing is positivity bias, which is, as humans, and there's a debate as to whether or not this is innately human or if this is cultural, we tend to go towards things that are positive rather than negative. A great example is the scientific process, the scientific method where we form a hypothesis, and hypotheses are typically stated as affirmative statements, right? I believe, or this XYZ is ABC, right? And that is an affirmative thing, and you go into the scientific method then attempting to prove that. And it's a positive thing you're trying to prove. If you prove it negatively, there is a subconscious bias, certainly thinking that I have failed. My hypothesis was wrong. But actually, in terms of the scientific process, you win because you know what didn't work. You know now what else I can do. Or it's just a piece of information that should have no positive or negative connotation, and yet you can't help but project it. And what augments this, right? Why we have these things that happen, what makes them more pernicious? And pressure, stress, fear, anxiety, the things that the stakes are higher. I'm doing things that could have a higher impact. I have investors who are asking more from me in a shorter period of time. These things will augment and make the typical process that we already have in terms of confirmation bias more substantial. I have many examples of confirmation bias. One hits close to home. I am a runner, and I have for years now, as I age, I wear knee braces on both my knees. My knees are perfectly healthy. And my wife, who's in the audience, and as a physician, took one look at me, and first time she saw it, and she was like, "What are you doing? Are you okay? Are your knees okay?" I'm like, "They're perfectly fine." And they're fine because I wear these knee braces. And she said, "That is medically unsound. I don't believe you." And I have had a long-standing argument about the structure of the knee braces and the support that it gives and how it makes me, a more comfortable runner. And as I got more deeply into the academic field of confirmation bias, one of the first papers that popped up was this: confirmation bias affects user perception of knee braces, which I wasn't going to show her, but then I eventually did. And the reality is that I was completely imbibed with my own sense that this mattered. And the reality is the physiology is not there. But I still wear them. And I feel better when I do. And that's fine. But there is a real interesting, especially in the medical field, the placebo effect is an example. So what are some common flavors of confirmation bias? Deliberate case building. So this is when we focus and collect facts disproportionately support our existing notions, right? And so part of what confirmation bias is a filter. It's a filter where we will innately will be drawn to things that, I already thought this, and that is even more. That even augments it more. That's really interesting, and there's a whole thread that goes down through that. And this is a really interesting and painful concept when we think about what happens in social media, and we think about the engines that generate content for us in the various ways that we consume on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, that is using this and using our mind's confirmation bias loop to continuously augment and build a case for something until it might be absurd, right? And there are many cases that we have seen in the past couple of years where people reach absurd places because of what they continue to augment and grow through their social network content. And belief persistence, we already talked about this. New facts and data are influenced by the first information adapted. This is very similar to deliberate case building, and this is the same thing as information primacy. And the last one is the human ego. We really want to believe that we are right. We form an opinion, and it's difficult for us to adopt something that challenges that opinion. And it's because we have trust in ourselves. And the more we find success, the less apt we are to believe something that is counter to our personal beliefs. I've run into many wealthy investors over the years, up to and including having a couple of half days with folks like Bill Gates or others. And in many different instances, there are moments where you realize that this person has been so successful that you have to find some way to give them a very concrete example that might challenge that. And usually the best ones are smart enough to recognize that this is happening, and they're actually really eager to be challenged. Some others not so much. So trying to understand where that sits and where on the spectrum each individual person who has both the power to fund you and support you and also has the ego that got them to where they are, it's a challenge. It's interesting to watch. So it dominates in policy, rationalization, and politics. We see this all the time. Judicial reasoning. People oftentimes, and these, by the way, are headings from another paper that I have on confirmation bias. There's a list of the areas in sort of society where we really have to watch it. And I'm just going to sort of go through this, and you can read these different instances. I just talked about the placebo effect, and you can imagine how all of them are tainted or supported or reinforced by confirmation bias, and how others can actually take advantage of confirmation bias effects in individuals. And I've talked about a couple of these. So I guess, I'm sorry, I just did the wrong thing. So now let's talk about entrepreneurship in the energy space. And this is sort of why I was brought here in part. I've been through this process a couple of times personally and with many other firms that I support one way or another. And you think of Thomas Edison, classic innovator in the energy space or the technology space in general. And there's a couple different examples of confirmation bias. I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. He is persistent and believes that what he has will work, and he's just continuously looking for things to solve the problem. Another Edison quote, though: "The battery is, in my opinion, a sensation, a mechanism for swindling. The storage battery is one of those peculiar things which appeals to the imagination, and no more perfect thing could be desired by stock swindlers." So I believe he means folks who are trying to sell stock in a company that does batteries. "Just as soon as man gets working on the secondary battery, it brings out his latent capacity for lying." And this is from the late 1800s. And he's saying here that this technology, and here he is, Thomas Edison, standing next to an early electric vehicle, right? EVs were back then. He invented the nickel-iron chemistry. It's actually very good battery chemistry. It's heavy and has its challenges, but it's actually quite remarkable. Took him a lot of time, and what he found is that everybody in that field was basically lying to themselves and lying to the world as they were trying to sell their product, and that persists, I think, today. So this part, as I mentioned, desires, it fuels persistence, and this kind of confirmation bias is good. The confirmation bias that he's identifying in this quote, though, is basically showing how misinformation can be generated and perpetrated in a couple different ways, right? And this goes back to the question from earlier: do we know we're faking it, or are we just fooling ourselves? And does it matter? I think maybe it does matter from an intent perspective, but as far as making good use of investment and doing the right thing entrepreneurially, we really should do everything we can to be aware of who's fooling who and to what extent. So energy technology, as most technologies go through, there's a thing called the Gartner hype curve. And this is commonly used to describe how new technologies are incepted and pushed out into the world. So the technology is invented. People get excited about it. Expectations grow. So expectation is the y-axis. Time is the x-axis. There is this peak of inflated expectations, and there's many different examples of this. You'll see a lot of, pieces in the popular press. You'll see a lot more money going to something that's exciting in the energy space. You'll see, a flood of, companies maybe started or whatever. And then there's a lot of failure. And we're in then the trough of disillusionment, right? So you go through, from an expectation perspective, this period where it's not going to work, or things are not happening, or this stop, no longer will this work. And I mentioned how many clean tech investments there were circa 2008 when I took my investment from Aqueon. This happened broadly in this space. There was a huge amount of investment in energy technology startups, and then there was a huge number of failures, and then there was far fewer investment for many years, from 2016 to 2020, very, very little. And now it's picking back up. The slope of enlightenment typically is when the trouble and the issues associated with the technology have been overcome and represented, and then there's incremental improvement and growth. Okay, and so and then finally you are productive and things are good. Those of you who are familiar with adoption curves, which is the lower right picture, is you've got the y-axis on the lower right is how much of a technology has been adopted, in time is the x-axis. And where we are right now with electric vehicle batteries, we're just sort of emerging from the trough of disillusionment. Early adopters are sort of now buying more and more cars. We have, middle single-digit % EV adoption in the United States. It's growing more quickly, but we've gone through 10 years now of crazy hype about car batteries and prices and driving ranges, and Elon Musk saying a lot of stories, some of which are true, some of which are not, and getting us to a place where we are finally, getting to some enlightenment and some productivity. And you can imagine many different technologies in the energy space, and I can, or other, technology spaces in general. You can look back and see where it's been. Now, why am I showing this? So both inflated expectation and disillusionment are going to be strong confirmation bias drivers. These are more extreme things. Remember, stress, anxiety, fear. These things are stress, anxiety, and fear. And these are going to alter the way you think about what you're doing if you're trying to innovate in this space. Slope of enlightenment sounds better, right? That's where you want to be, but you have to go through this ride to get there. And that's where, and a company might go through this curve, or an entire, industrial area, might go through this curve. It depends on sort of how you look at it. But regardless, if you find yourself in inflated expectations or disillusionment, be more aware, perhaps, of what kind of confirmation bias you might be experiencing. And another thing I want to sort of point out is that this is true for both inventors and the entrepreneurs. Both sides have to interact with each other, and they both are going to be suffering from confirmation bias. So specifically, investors, they want their investments to work, right? They're smart people. They have these big egos. They have a real sense of drive and desire to succeed. And they often try to apply their expertise from other fields. And this goes back to the preconceived notion in information primacy I talked about. World famous, internet programmer, right, makes a huge amount of money doing, whatever, inventing something really important, then wants to work on batteries. I've talked to many of these people. They don't know anything about batteries, right? But they have done so much good in someplace else, and they believe that their decision process is viable, right? It may or may not be, but that lack of connection that they have with how different things can be in one space over another is painful for them. And this is, in my opinion, one of the primary reasons why too many companies were funded, over a decade ago, and why there was so much failure. And the investors are trying to find a way to balance risk and reward. They have a portfolio of money. They have a portfolio of companies. They want to distribute the money properly to get success in a broad way. And so that's what they're interested in. The inventors who are interacting with the investors, they want their ideas to work. They want to feel smart, right? They want this, this is just like the investors for different reasons want to feel smart. Investors want to feel smart because they picked a good person or a good idea. And the inventors want to feel smart because their idea worked, right? And so understanding the humanness of both of those things and how they may interact is really important. Unlike the investors who only get data that's cultivated for them by the inventors, the entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs get a huge range of data from their ideas. I can't tell you how many thousands of batteries I've made with my own hands or I've seen made by my colleagues and folks I'm collaborating with, and the amount of good and bad data that I get. And it's really difficult to look at a great result and a bad result and take them in equally. I want to forget about the bad result. And I want to be like, well, why did this good result work? What happened? What did you put in there? How'd that work? What's the test conditions? All of that stuff. And then it's the good result that gets passed up to the investors. They probably never hear about the bad result, right? And that sort of information filter is a problem because it feeds the investors primacy and information bias, and it also reinforces, your own sort of filter as well. So being aware of that is highly, highly important. And you have to answer to these investors, and that's why you're only feeding them good news. And you have limited time to get things right. And so there's this feedback loop is a cycle of stress for both sides, right? And remember, stress, fear, anxiety, this fuels confirmation bias and amps it up a little bit more, making us in a situation that's, I think, very challenging. So I've been through now sort of a high-level sort of tour of what is confirmation bias and how it applies, at least in my mind, to the kinds of things that I'm engaged in, which is innovation in the energy technology space. And I've got 3 case studies I'm going to go through. The last one is from Aqueon, my own company, and the previous 2 are, I think, sort of really interesting ones for different reasons. This is a classic, cold fusion. I'm going to disclose my age because I was in high school when this happened. It was the late 1980s, it was 1989, and there was this massive announcement. These 2 researchers who were previously just completely obscure at the University of Utah, 2 physicists, Pons and Fleischmann, had a press conference where they came out and said that they were able to generate more heat and more energy out of this test cell than they put into it. It was an electrochemical cell with a palladium wire and some heavy water, and they were doing a very specific kind of test to it. And there were these anomalous heat output events, they called them, that they believed they couldn't characterize it. And oh my gosh, we have found an infinite source of free energy, right? Interestingly, the market for palladium overnight quadrupled. Everyone invested in palladium because it was going to change the world. There was this massive shift, and at the time, one of the most popular new technologies that was being used more broadly was the fax machine, and apparently the fax machines were faxing information all around the world about this to different researchers and physicists trying to understand what's going on. So they invented the concept of cold fusion as an explanation of this. And then they rushed it out as a press release. And they became internationally famous or infamous, depending on sort of where you were on the curve. But everyone couldn't believe what they were seeing. And subsequent to that, they couldn't really repeat the result in any sort of reliable way, nor could they document any radiation coming from the system. And if they were indeed doing any kind of actual fusion, you would have to generate some kind of radiation just based on typical nuclear physics theory. Couldn't do that. And this drove hundreds of very prominent scientists around the world to try to verify this. And some sort of drank the Kool-Aid and really thought they also verified it because they also noticed some extra heat or something else happened, and that this is real. And it really did create some interesting divides, and it's a just absolutely fascinating story. And to this day, never confirmed, and it does still persist as a scientific concept. Some researchers still think this is something that should be looked at. Google X has a cold fusion program. Some colleagues of mine have actually done some work in it without committing to it being a real thing. The question is there anything there at all? And I propose to this audience that there's probably nothing there, and that the entire phenomenon of people still looking at it is just part of a larger set of confirmation bias. There's a fantastic book about this, though. It's called Bad Science. It's one of my favorite books, and it talks about front to back what happened here and gets into the psychology of both Pons and Fleischmann and also others who were trying to assess whether or not this was real or not. And a lot of sort of questionable choices that were made along the way, including not going to peer review first and having a good, a perfect set of data to demonstrate this before sharing it with the world. They were really excited and they wanted to seem smart and seem like they really had gotten something. So case study 2, it's a company called SACT3. This is a solid-state battery company out of the University of Michigan, circa 2009, 2010. And they had a leader who claimed to have solved a couple of key problems. And if you follow energy technologies or battery technologies, one of the holy grails is a completely solid battery that has no liquid electrolyte. It's not flammable. It's easy to assemble. And it's something that could be integrated in a much smaller package. So you could drive farther, for the same size pack that goes in your vehicle. And this technology became, the leader, Emery Sastry, became pretty famous. She very good at promoting her concepts and had an awful lot of momentum. Went to the White House, got a fair amount of funding support, but many others in the industry, other people doing innovation and other researchers, never saw any data. Literally no data. Never presented. Never created. And it came to pass that almost no one had seen data. And this article is out of Quartz magazine by a guy named Steve Levine. Really did a deep investigative dive in 2015, 2016. And he reports in this Quartz article that even within the company, the workers in the company didn't realize what data was happening. They weren't talking to each other. Everybody was siloed. And it came to pass that it was unclear what they had. And then Dyson bought them, which is kind of a surprise. Dyson at the time, Dyson was going to, this was about 5 years ago, pour in billions of dollars and make their own battery factory. They were going to get into the electric vehicle business. They also wanted new batteries for their vacuum cleaners. And this purchase was fantastic for her and for this company because they were, all of a sudden part of this major, push. But 2 years later, they basically completely disconnected themselves from this venture. The founder moved on to a different venture entirely that's not energy related, and Dyson walked away from all the patents that were associated with this. And what happened was that what many of us knew just by looking from the outside took Dyson and other companies a couple $100 million to discover. There was nothing there. And it's a fantastic case study and there's an open question. Did the founders and those working on this believe there was nothing there, or did they believe they had something and just kept on thinking that it was going to be solved? If we could just do this one more thing, if I can just figure out a better way to do this, it will work. It's going to happen. I don't know, and I will never know probably the answer, but it is a classic example in the battery space of something that really just didn't work. So this is my company, Aqueon Energy, founded in 2008, and it was a completely different battery chemistry. It was a sodium-ion battery, not a lithium-ion battery. It used basically just neutral pH salt water as an electrolyte, so very easy to put together. Some of the key components of the system are over here. This is an electrode, which is about a 2 by 2 inch by 1 millimeter thick electrode, and it's sort of arranged in this. It's arranged in this battery. It's sort of stacked up like a layer cake, and it took a while to conceive. From maybe a couple of years from a very simple test cell in the lab at Carnegie Mellon to something that we grew a bit more. My first round of funding, and I mentioned that the venture firms at the time were like shooting fast and furious to get these companies up and starting. My venture firm, Kleiner Perkins Caulfield Byers, they were very conservative in that they tranched my seed round such that I would only get all of it if a third party could do comprehensive testing on my material set to prove that it worked. And this is where I was like, oh, no, it doesn't matter what I think. This stuff has to work, and it has to be cold, hard data that they all see before they move forward. They did this because they had seen a couple other firms fall victim to the kind of scenario I just showed in the previous slide. It turns out that in SACT3, hard data was rarely given even to the the investors, the board of directors. But here, they wanted to see all the data, and they weren't even going to pull the trigger on a second round of seed funding until they saw it. So I hit that proof, proud to do it, and it was a very good day. And 4 years later, we had taken over $30 million in investment. We were presently asking for $35 million more. We had about 100 employees, and we had struck a deal with the state of Pennsylvania to build a factory. So the stakes were high. We were in a place of high impact and a place of what we thought was relatively low technical risk. We had reduced our technical risk, and we were spending more money because we were going to scale this. But there was a huge problem that came up. We realized that the anode material, and when I say the anode material, this is a huge deal. This is half of the battery. So batteries are made of cathode and anode. Cathode is a positive, anode is a negative. The anode was not going to work. We could not scale it up and produce it at the economics that we had to be able to do. It would be impossible for us to do. We realized that for 2 or 3 reasons it was not going to work. And so we had some real issues, right? What do you do when you're in a situation, lots at stake, investors are really wanting this, you've got, a state organization, the Department of Energy had given us like $7 million. There was a lot of pressure, and we, at the end of the day, as CTO, I looked at the data and I was like, look, we can't make this like we're talking about. We have to find something else. So we had a couple alternate ideas, but it was really early days, right? I mean, really early days. I had less than a milligram examples of this material, and it looked like it was going to be functional, but it was like functional in 5 or 10 years, and we realized that we had to have it this year. Like we had to design the factory to make this material, and the factory was already partly put together. So there was a couple of options, and I went to the investors and the board of directors, and we were like, look, we have to do this. If we don't do this, the company should shut down tomorrow, or we are going to spend 6 more months and see if this works, and then if it does, then we'll try it, and if it's not going to work, then we'll shut the company down. They had already invested enough money, and they were willing to their own confirmation bias that up until that point, we had been honest with them and delivered was helpful to them, right? And so they were like, okay, we're going to take this Hail Mary. We did very aggressive R&D, and it paid off. It did work. We actually completely swapped in a totally new material system that we didn't conceive of when we started to build the factory, which is sort of mind-blowing. And you can see in the bottom, this is just an example of our production line. We made many tens of megawatt hours of batteries and shipped them worldwide, and they were functional. They worked. But they worked because there was a gigantic amount of confirmation bias all around between the inventors and the entrepreneurs as well as the investors. In retrospect, any rational group of people in a normal environment probably wouldn't have encouraged this. They probably would have been like, well, that's too bad. Sorry that your idea didn't work, but we have to stop because it's ridiculous to build a factory that is going to be making materials that have not been proven yet, especially for battery chemistry. So there's an interesting side note here, which is maybe confirmation bias in this case was a good thing. And it kept the company going at considerable risk, and we had a lot of learnings to do, and the learning curve was hard. And by 2017, the company had hit our economic goal that we set out to have. In 2008, we were going to sell batteries at under $300 a kilowatt hour for stationary storage. We hit that. Unfortunately, lithium-ion batteries were cheaper than that. And the investor base was very skittish, and the political environment around energy technologies was highly unknown in 2017. So we actually sold the company at a huge loss and moved on. And it went over to Asia, and there's a couple of places around the world where this technology is being made now. There's one Chinese company and one company in Europe that are both producing it. So and I'm interacting with them, and it's fun to watch, but it's not this company. This company was sort of like crashed for other reasons that are partly beyond the story of confirmation bias, but there are, of course, stories around there as well. So those are the case studies, and you can sort of see how I've woven in confirmation bias to the stories of the studies. And this is taken right out of the read-ahead that I sent here a couple weeks ago. And they have a really nice table that you would ask your entrepreneurs during the process. And these are key questions. Are errors driven by the self-interest of anyone? Are individuals overly fond of the strategy they're proposing? Are there dissenting opinions? And you could read through the rationale as to why you should be asking yourself this question whenever you go to push through something in an entrepreneurial way. And this is either from a technical data perspective or any other sort of strategy perspective that you have. And this brings me to the last slide, and then I hope we can have a dialogue. Some take-home messages. What are the daily or everyday ethics aspects of this? How do you incorporate the concept of confirmation bias into your own work or your own thing any given day? Or if you aspire to be an entrepreneur or work in energy technologies, what does that mean for you? So first, accept that you are constantly experiencing many different types of confirmation biases. You can't avoid it. By being human, you are this. Observed by Francis Bacon and many others. Be aware of the situations where stress is elevated. And I've talked about the different places and times where the fear, the anxiety, the stress is elevated, and that is where you're more prone to probably adopt things that are even more extreme to justify what you're doing. Strive to understand the stakes. What are the consequences? What are the consequences if my bias is not supported? What's the probability of this happening, right? So think about the risk, consequence and risk and frequency of that risk. And if you think about, I must have confirmation bias, and what if my confirmation bias is leading me the wrong way, then what's the consequence that will hopefully make you, support you making a more measured decision around what you're trying to accomplish. Use quantitative metrics in gating and project planning. So this is what my investors did early on. They're like, look, we don't care what you say. We need to see data that is objective, that from a third party that confirms what you say. So trust but verify. Do this with yourself, and it will help you succeed. Decide what things are crossover from good. Decide what things are going to cross over from good to bad. What is the line between inspiration and malfeasance, right? At what point are you starting to lie as opposed to lying to yourself or lying to others versus just believing that what you're doing is going to work? At what point do the data that you're seeing and incorporating, when is your selective data collection and then passing on, when does it cross the line? When are you leaving behind data that's bad too much, right? And what does that too much look like? You need to decide beforehand where that line is so that you don't get into a spot where that line creeps and you end up really misrepresenting things, and either purposely or not purposely. I've seen this a number of times in companies that I work with, and you have to be like, whoa, 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 what's really happening here? Where's all the data? Is that true all the time? And then sometimes it comes out that it's not, or something very different is happening. And this is where you can pull yourself out of what could be a really bad situation. And stay on the right side of all of these things, and you should be able to harness the power of your confirmation bias to find the best path. If you recognize that it always exists and you realize that it can drive inspiration, then maybe you can actually come out better by understanding yourself and this process. And so that's what I have for you guys, and I hope we have some time for some conversation.
All right, we have a few minutes for questions. We have one from the front row, and I'm going to pass this mic around so the folks that are participating virtually can hear well.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. So you had a slide up before that came up when you were talking. You were giving me, or you were giving the audience a case, one of the case studies. The slide had something to do with the entrepreneurs or the investors.
Oh yeah, sure.
Right. So the investors.
This one.
Right. So they have expertise from another field, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so and the particular example that you gave, which I think we all can totally imagine, right, is the tech entrepreneur programmer who then wants to do batteries. But
yeah.
Of course, those are very different. Okay. So I can understand the problem there. But I was wondering, so that seems to me to be a kind of problem of a general type about the quality of information inputs, right? So here you have expertise from a very different field, and that's giving you a problem with respect to the information input, right? But I was wondering if you would also get a problem on the flip side. That is, it seems to me that sometimes in order to get a good decision being made, you also need input from people from other fields, right? Because they can bring new perspectives, they can see how to solve problems in a different way, get your organization out of a rut, so to speak. And so I was wondering if you had any insight about how to get the right balance, right, between, you know, inputs from outside and inputs from inside.
Yes. Yeah, the power of the naive perspective, right? I make up for my lack of experience with lack of experience. Certainly. Yeah, this is exactly right. And I think the key thing is to identify when someone is bringing a really great idea from a naive perspective versus when someone is trying to assert their ideas or their concept without recognizing it's a naive perspective, right? So the best people who bring ideas to the table in this like forum are aware that they are not experts, right? But they look, hey, I have a high level pattern recognition, and I saw this in my other field, and I think I see it here. What do you guys think? Right, that's what you want to hear, right? That's the good input, as opposed to, I was right when I did this, and we're doing it now, right? So it's a lot of how they can, like someone who's coming into that dialogue, how they couch it, right? How they recognize their own role with their degree of expertise and how it fits in. I've really, except with some of the people I've collaborated with, are just dead brilliant in one field, and they are actually pretty good in batteries too, but they've self-taught and tried to figure out, and they are hesitant they don't know where they fit, right? But they always couch it like that, right? Yeah. And then there are others who literally, I have sat down across the table from a wealthy internet investor, and they have told me, first sentence, I'm very smart. Right, like that's what they will. Literally, they want to establish. They want to make sure that I know this in no uncertain terms that they are smart, and they will tell me what I should do. Right, that's the opposite. So you have to be aware, I think, of both sides.
Can I just ask one follow-up?
Sure.
Do you have any way or procedure, or just general way of thinking about how to or when to try to reach out and elicit the viewpoint or input from people who aren't experts in that particular field? Like, how do you know, how do you even know when to go and who to go to and when it's not just going to be a waste of time?
So usually, and this is, I'm speaking from my own personal experience, and that is, there are a network of people that are involved with these ventures, right? There's the various venture funds, there's the partners in those firms. Many of them are entrepreneurs themselves, and many of them know other people. And usually if there's a problem or there's something happening or there's a company that's growing, they'll be like, hey, I know this other person, and that person was not in this field, but they did something XYZ that's similar. And then a connection is made and a conversation is had. So it's somewhat formalized, but in an ad hoc way. And if someone doesn't vouch for somebody or you don't personally know them, I'm much less apt to be interested in taking that advice. But if somebody is well-known or someone else vouches for them that I trust, then I would sit down and be like, okay, well, you don't know batteries, but tell me what you're thinking. And then, but again, it's like making sure that we both understand the confirmation bias and the reality of what's happening, right? And that's the most important thing is the context and the methodology of the connection that was made, I think.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Other questions? To pick up where Aaron left off, it seems like I really like this slide because it sort of shows the degree to which this ends up being a closed system. Are there, you've given us a lot to think about with respect to how humble we need to be regarding our own objectivity. You've given us suggestions to kind of keep a check on that ourselves. But are there structures that should be put in place Or are there other processes that like punch a hole in that closed system and let it breathe a little bit better?
I mean, there absolutely should be methodologies to like get this so it's not like a feedback loop that creates like, you know, unfortunate outcomes, right? Which it can spiral out of control really easily. You know, I haven't seen too many, and what I've seen is a lot of spiral out of control and a lot of failure, right? And because this feedback loop is rarely positive, it's usually negative. You know, one thing that does happen, an automatic thing that happens, is that an early investor in a concept or in a venture, they may lose an appetite for it, and then other people come in and invest. Usually, like the company will be devalued, and maybe they have to do some layoffs, but a new set of investors will come in and start again, sort of. And there's a lot of these ventures that in the energy space have done this kind of breathing. One firm will come in, pump them up with a lot of money. This cycle of stress happens, and then it's not working, right? So those initial investors usually cut bait, but instead of the company just going into Chapter 7 or Chapter 11, other investors come in and will pay, you know, a lesser amount of money to invest in the company and keep going. I can think of multiple choices of that. So that is maybe an example of self-regulation, but it's kind of a catastrophic self-regulation. Like the feedback loop is like a failure on one side, or maybe even both sides, and there's a restructuring. I mean, I've seen also the companies fully restructure, and the company name persists, and maybe some of the patents persist, but most of the staff turn over. And so that's kind of like it's not a positive way of this happening. It happens in sort of a very destructive way. And I think your question is how can we do this in a way that's not destructive is a great one. I proposed to you that one of the things that it should be done, or that one of the things that is done that should do this, but probably usually doesn't, is most of these firms will have third-party or impartial board members, and their job is to be at the board level and to review all sides and to, you know, render their opinions. But usually they're not truly impartial, right? Usually they're a friend of somebody, or they're brought in for a reason, or they're from a potential, you know, acquiring company down the road. And so there's always like vested interest, and they're not really doing what they should be doing on paper. If that person in that seat, that impartial third-party board member, was really doing their job as it's intended, I think it could help with this, but not often.
I think it's really interesting to think about how it operates within the scientific method, too. Mm-hmm. I'll be percolating on that for a while.
There's a question back there.
Hi. I actually interned this past summer as a R&D chemist. Mm-hmm. And so on your slide about Aqueon Energy, you mentioned that you incorporated like aggressive R&D strategies. So I was just wondering like what those included.
Got it. Aggressive R&D. Yeah, it's a fair question. So I think the easiest way to say it is using, you know, not using incremental approaches to, you know, improving your. This was a material set we were improving, right? And the way to do it normally is to change one thing at a time, and to take a bunch of data and then to understand the implications of that, and then to do another increment, right? Or to make a really well-defined experimental matrix and perform, you know, statistical analysis, design of experiments, all of that. This was much more like, this works, we think this will work, we think this will work, and it was a much more of a much less refined process where we had a couple of things that we hoped would work that happened to have worked, right? It was aggressive and much more risky. On the other hand, if you can jump from this point to this point without doing all the matrix of experiments, you can save months of time. And months of time we didn't have. Like every month, our burn rate was in the many millions of dollars, and an extra month of experimentation was incredibly expensive. And so we couldn't throw money at time either, right? Because the amount of time for testing was what it was. So we had to just jump around and make some really, you know, unusual things, right? And again, this is partially based on our own confirmation bias. We had confidence that this was going to work, right? I know that this worked, and I've seen this somewhere else. I'm going to do it now, and it's going to work, right? It happened to work, but, you know, that was lucky. To think it was anything but luck would be like disingenuous, right? And because we didn't have a clear experimental path between some of the jumps that we made.
Okay, thank you.
This is just going a little bit further into the comments about, poking holes into this feed loop, because we do have in the scientific community certain ways to check, but they can be circumvented. The thing that pops into my head is in 1998, Andrew Wakefield's data. It was published in a peer-reviewed paper, but he falsified all the data.
Yeah.
So that peer
Yeah.
review that was supposed to be there for a check, it kind of just fell flat. So when we do try to poke holes in this feed loop, if you have someone dedicated to being unethical, it can still be avoided. So as educators, we have to get the point across that you have to realize your responsibility for ethical science at every level.
Yeah, I mean, there is, at least in part of all that I'm talking about, the presumption that you're being ethical, right? And again, this goes back to the early slide, Elizabeth Holm. It doesn't pay off. Like being unethical when you're trying to create a venture that eventually will work, like lying about the fundamental thing of what you're trying to do, will never pay off, right? Because at some point you will no longer be able to lie. Like it either works or it doesn't. And that is, I think, a distinct thing. It's actually more problematic for someone who's able to falsify data and publish it in a fancy journal. That data may never lead to a product, and they may be able to, in principle, get away with it, right? Because and someone may try to recreate it, but someone might not try to recreate it, right? And then it may just stand as a result that they, and that's truly unfortunate, right? And I like to think that in the entrepreneurial and like venture growth world, reality eventually is going to check unethical people, because either the product will work or it will not. And the peer review process is inherently flawed, as we all know, and it's really difficult. Like the presumption is made that the data that's presented in a paper was collected properly, right? And if it's not, everything's out the window. And I don't know, just acknowledging that as a truth, and then making and also understanding that there are unscrupulous people who might use falsified data to get money to do a company, when it's again, why you would do this, I don't know, but for sure people do. And I think this gives the investors some pause, right? Certainly, one of the things that happens before a firm will give anyone funding is they will do a number of character references. I went through this in a pretty deep way the first time I did this. I had personal interviews, and then they interviewed 3 or 4 people that I'd worked with. They went back 2 or 3 jobs. Like, I'm trusting, $10 million to this young person. Are they the real deal, right? And so part of it's a matter of character even, and the best firms do probe character.
I think an interesting point, though, also is, given that our big brains can engage in processes like confirmation bias, there's a slippery slope toward engaging in ethical behavior, right? Like probably most people don't start off deciding they're going to be unethical and trick everyone, but before we know it, there we are.
Yeah.
It happens to the best of us. All right, one more question. If no one else has one, would you take just a couple of minutes and tell us a little bit about your path? So one of the things that, we have students that are making decisions about how they're going to spend their personal capital in the world, and what kind of impact they want to have. And I wonder if you could tell just a little bit about your path and how you ended up working on renewable energy, and what that's meant.
Yeah, so as I said, I went to Oberlin College. I majored in physics. I had a minor in philosophy. And I really got the itch to do energy and renewable technology when I was at Oberlin. My mentor there, by the name of John Schofield, he was a physics professor, and he was working on early days solar, like next generation solar panel technology, photovoltaics. And I was really taken by both the science of it as well as the impact of it. And I had developed then, and something that persisted throughout my career, I only want to do work that has relative near-term impact, that has interesting scientific hurdles, right? Like those are and is in the energy space. So I want to save the world by doing important science that, in the near term could have some impact. That was sort of like where I left at, my undergrad degree. And then I had, kind of a checkered history. I actually went to graduate school in physics. I interned for a summer in Colorado, and then went out there to physics graduate school and left during the first semester. I was like, this is not for me. And then I enrolled at University of Michigan in the School of Engineering, which was a total gear change. And I'm not so sure how deep the engineering curriculum is here, but Oberlin had no idea what engineering was. And it was very distinct from natural sciences in a lot of ways. And so I had to do an awful lot of adjustment. And I credit that pivot that I had to go through with a lot of my subsequent success in my career, because I had to learn how to incorporate things differently. I had to learn how to differentiate between the way different cultures think. Like the natural science physics culture thinks very differently than than the engineering culture. And being aware of those differences, I think, was really important for me translationally as I then moved around other places in my career. But I got my degree there in material science, and I went there to work on it was metallized back contacts for solar PV panels. So more technology, very similar to what I was interested in. I showed up on the first day in my research group at Michigan, and my advisors promptly told me that the grant that they had won to support that work didn't happen. It was withdrawn by Congress. And I ended up spending 4 years not doing energy technology at all. I just became a condensed matter physics material scientist sort of at large. But my advisors gave me some good advice. They were like, it doesn't matter what you do for your PhD dissertation. What matters is, A, you learn how to learn. You learn how to synthesize thought, synthesize good results, write good papers, communicate yourself. And you learn techniques that you can apply in a variety of places. So different characterization techniques, analytical techniques, modeling techniques. So I focused on those things, learning how to do good work and how, learning critical techniques. And then I immediately, after I earned my PhD, got a position at Caltech where I was working on ionic materials for energy things, and then that parlayed to 7 years at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So I worked at JPL, and that's really where I started working on batteries and energy technologies. I worked on the batteries that are in the Mars rovers. I did a bunch of other things. I was trained as a systems engineer, which was really fascinating to me because I learned all about power systems and systems optimization. And then I got the job at Carnegie Mellon, which was this weird appointment in material science and engineering and public policy. And the public policy part was really because of my systems engineering experience at JPL. And that allowed me to sort of portray myself accurately as somebody who could both do basic fundamental things and also understand the systems level implication of those things, which was of interest to Carnegie Mellon. And then I had this interesting finding in my lab at CMU and spun this company out. So I think the theme is that I was always open to new and sort of unusual pathways, and got really good at pivoting and taking in different information. And you end up, putting in your time in 2 or 3 different fields or subfields, and you get very comfortable with the ambiguity of newness, right? And then you get better at learning more quickly the key things that matter. So my advice to anybody who's interested in sort of this pathway is prepare yourself to keep learning, learn the tools that you will need, you can apply in many places, and take opportunities whenever you can. Work at it, even if the first job you have at a firm is not the one you want, if you see other people at that firm doing things you like, go there. Because you can move around. Get your foot in the door first and figure out what's next once you're inside. I think those handful. Oh, and the last thing is, as you think about what you want to do next, find somebody who's 5 years ahead of you that you want to be, right? And how did they get there? What were they? I mean, you're not going to take the same path. It's going to be different. Everything is going to be different. But on the same token, you can look at sort of how they manipulated their own lives and careers and decisions that they made. And that will lead you to that kind of place too. You might not end up right there, but you'll learn more when you think about models, near-term models, 5 years ahead.
All right. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming.